So it's with great privilege that we warmly welcome Phil and Jyotish and Devi this evening for the life of Yogananda. Please.
Well, thank you, Narayan. It's an honor to be here. I always enjoy being in Ananda settings, and especially wonderful to share a platform twice in 1 week with my friends Jyotish and Devi. One of the things that happens when you write a biography is you find out colorful little facts. So I'm going to share with you that the song that opened the evening. In 1927, Yogananda was booked to give a talk at Carnegie Hall in New York. The place was packed. He chose to sing that song for almost an hour and a half. It was a really mind-blowing event, but he felt Carnegie Hall was meant for music, and people tried to talk him out of it, and he said, no, no, music is a universal spiritual language, people will get it. And he did it. Let me begin by addressing the proverbial elephant that follows me wherever I go these days, which is the question, how can you have the temerity to write a biography of a great human being who is known all over the world for his autobiography? I know some of you were thinking that. And there are a few answers, and I'll try to be brief. One is that I'm paying off the karma by having borrowed Autobiography of a Yogi in 1970 and never returned. I never became a formal student of Yogananda's or a disciple. I had my own path, and but I always admired him, always learned from him over the subsequent years. And when I was researching American Veda, the book Narayan just mentioned, I had to write about all the gurus who came to the West. And he stood out, of course, as, if not the most influential, certainly he's tied for the lead. I also became fascinated by his personal life, by the human story of Yogananda, about which we know more than we do about the personal lives of most renunciates, most gurus. Very few of them speak about their lives prior to having taken vows as swamis or brahmacharis. But he did, and others spoke of his life. And I became fascinated with it, but I only had one short chapter to devote to it. And so after the book had been out a while, and I thought of what else I want to do next, the idea came to me to write a full-on, objective biography from birth to death, as we say in the trade. And to my surprise, no one else had done that. There are memoirs Kriyananda had written about memories of being with his guru, and others, direct disciples, did, but they were not real biographies. They were more like tributes and memoirs. And then I reread an Autobiography of a Yogi and realized how much he left out. I'm sure most of you have read it, and you'll remember that a lot of the book is about people other than himself. And there's a reason for that. He set out to write a book early on called The Yogi Christs of India. And he started gathering these portraits of great saints and yogis. And then somehow the book morphed into a combination of that and his own memoir, his own autobiography. But he leaves out a lot. And he leaves out especially his life here in America. He came here in 1920. He was only 27. Except for the 16 months he was in Europe and India in 1935 and 6. he lived the rest of his life here. And by here, I mean here in LA mostly, in Southern California. It was all over America, especially in the 20s and 30s. He was quite the itinerant monk, filling up large auditoriums and all over the country, and building his organization. So we know of Yogananda, and we admire Yogananda and revere Yogananda because of the work he did here in those last 32 years of his life, and yet less than 10% of his autobiography is about that. There are big gaps of time. So my job was to fill the gaps. And I'm convinced that everybody who reads it will learn something new. And to give it historical context. His childhood in India, the years he was here, and through the Roaring '20s and the Depression and World War II, to give it historical context that he himself couldn't do without the benefit of hindsight all these years later. So that's why. So don't complain. And the other thing I want to emphasize at the beginning here, I don't want to go through the facts of his life, but it was a compelling human story. I set out to write the story of a human being. Many people feel Yogananda was an avatar, an incarnation of God. Others feel he was just, he was a highly realized yogi and great master teacher. Whatever your understanding of Yogananda's spiritual status or cosmic status, he was still a human being, living a human life. And the story of how Mukunda Lal Ghosh, born in 1893, grew up to become Paramhansa Yogananda was intriguing to me. That's a human story. He had parents, he had a background, he lived in different cities. He spent his formative teenage years in Calcutta, which was sort of like the New York City of India at that time, and the neighborhood he was in was kind of like Greenwich Village. These things shaped him. He was in the shadow of the great Swami Vivekananda and Ramakrishna. All these things affected his life and who he became, and I got intrigued by that. And some of the things I discovered, it was fascinating to discover the teenage Yogananda, who was a natural leader, but other natural leaders would be, organizing soccer games and parties and mischief, and he was organizing satsangs and starting a little ashram when he was 15, and taking his friends to meet swamis and gurus and go to temples and all that. He was marked for the role he was to play, and then he was shaped by experience and by his guru. And all that was fascinating. Even more fascinating to me, because he hadn't written much about it, and no one else had, was his life here in America and how he adapted to life here and what it was like and what he endured. And the biggest surprise to me was how challenging it was and the difficulties he had to face. Not just personally, because he was a stranger in a strange land, and a dark-skinned, long-haired one at that, in the 1920s and 30s, when traveling looking like that could be hazardous to one's health. And he faced the dark side of America. He faced racism and religious bigotry and all kinds of stuff. He endured lawsuits. He endured what he called betrayals by people. He had money problems. He was building an organization, and he did not want to be a CEO, but he did. He had to deal with things that everyday entrepreneurs have to deal with, paying the bills and dealing with managing human beings who could be problems. All those things he was fairly candid about in some of his commentary and his private letters. And he always had this little push and pull that he had from childhood on of enjoying the world and then later of having this great mission that was given to him by his guru lineage, and having the commitment to fulfilling that mission of bringing Vedic knowledge to the West and doing it well and doing it with dignity and integrity. And at the same time, he always had the impulse he had from childhood, which was he just wanted to go into seclusion and be close to God and be a monk. And the lure of the Himalayas, the lure of the Ganges, was always with him. And when things got tough, he was tempted to give it up and go back to India. But he never did. And that persistence and will to live his dharma and do it well was really intriguing to me and deeply inspiring. And a reminder that no matter what our spiritual path may be, and no matter how advanced we are or think we are, we still have human lives. And the stuff of human lives will come to us. We'll get backaches. We'll get sick. People will die. People will, try to cheat us. We'll lose money and gain money. All these things. And the promise of the yogic life of having permanent peace and bliss eventually, and full awareness of the divine nature of the self, all that is real. And we all can sense growing toward that. And in Yogananda's case, you see the moments in his life when he came to fully realize those aspirations. And he wrote about that with great eloquence. But he still had a human life, and he had to deal with it. And he was concerned about those things. And I found that tremendously inspiring and instructive. And it makes me think, stop complaining. If Yogananda could deal with that, you deal with it too. Just come back to your inner divine nature. Because he would never forget, and didn't let any of his followers forget, that while they have to do their work and while they have to do their duty, the principal task was self-realization. And that was the foundation of everything else, including doing the job well. You see that in his life. There are lessons to be learned from that life. It's not just an interesting life, not just a unique tale of an extraordinary person, but it's an instructive life. It's one we can take away lessons to apply to our own lives. Thanks.
Thank you.
Well, I'll say that Phil, I read the book first in manuscript form because Phil wanted us to comment, make sure that from our viewpoint the facts were correct, which he had many, many more facts than we did, but also that Yogananda was treated with proper respect, even though Phil had to be the historian in telling Yogananda's tale. So we read it first in the manuscript form and then have read, subsequent iterations. And I am very deeply thankful to Phil for what he's done for me personally, but in a sense more so for what he's done for everybody in terms of the life and story of Yogananda. I read the Autobiography more than 50 years ago. I read it in 1966. And I don't know whether I didn't return it or what the karma was, but that book absolutely changed my life. And my life from that time on, or very shortly after reading it, 2 or 3 months after reading it, I met Swami Kriyananda, who, as Phil said, had been a direct disciple of Yogananda. So I became connected with Swami Kriyananda and Yogananda, and that became my life. So, you know, for 50 years, I've heard stories of Master. I've read the Autobiography of a Yogi countless times, and we always laugh because every time you read that book, somebody has inserted a new chapter into it that you didn't read before, or new language, because you never, it's like Yogananda talked about in a beautiful poem, the spiral staircase of life. You keep returning, but never at the same level on which you went through that same circle before. Reminds me of just a slight diversion. Some years ago we gave a course on Patanjali, a week-long course. We had a man who was very, had a good sense of humor, and at the end of the course we were sharing what we gained from the course and kind of a wrap-up session as one often does in these kinds of things. And this fellow said, "You know, I'm still confused, but at a much higher level." And so the life of Yogananda, I have circled around and around and around in this spiral staircase and touched on it. But I've circled within, and most people have until this book came out, we've circled within a certain kind of a universe. There have only been a certain number of facts and a certain number of anecdotes and a certain number of stories. And so there's just been, I don't know, the universe of knowledge about Yogananda was relatively contained. Yogananda didn't talk about himself very much, and his autobiography didn't explain that, nor did anyone else. Swami Kriyananda did basically the same thing that Yogananda did when he wrote his autobiography, The New Path. He took his life as he was growing up. Then the major section of the book is meeting Yogananda and the 3.5 years with which he was with Yogananda, which ended in 1952, and then that's it. He doesn't talk about the rest of his life in that path, in his autobiography either. So those biographies kind of end without the story being completed. Well, Phil comes along and he fills in not only a lot of facts, but for me, as he was saying, I could see the arc of the human life of Yogananda and the struggles that he went through and the rhythms that he went through. You know, I kind of had the vague impression that Yogananda came to America and spent a couple of weeks doing something and then filled up Carnegie Hall. Well, it wasn't that way at all. You know, there was a lot of struggle in the slow growth until he was able to do that. But you get a lot of that sense of the rhythm and sense of the struggle and sense of the human drama from Phil's book. And the other thing that is really important is that with these great saints, great souls like Yogananda, they get put up on a pedestal. And as time goes on, that pedestal kind of gets cranked up by the passage of time until it gets higher and higher, and then it doesn't seem like they're really quite human. And so, yes, sure, they can say, you know, be honest or be happy or life is a struggle for joy, and there are thousands of beautiful statements by Yogananda. But there's the tendency to say, well, yeah, but he didn't have a life like the rest of us. And Phil brings that pedestal back down to a human level and lets us see that even at the greatness of someone like Yogananda, he still has to go through that human drama, the same human drama that you and I go through. Now, for us, because our connection has been less historical and more on a spiritual level, for us, the traversing of that human drama is more dependent on the spiritual consciousness and the attitudes and the practices and the way to approach life. You know, part of our teachings is that we have transited out of Kali Yuga, which is the age of form and things I compare that to water, which has been frozen solid. And so you've got ice, you can cut it into blocks and you can move those blocks around and they stay where you put them and so on. Now we've moved into the age of energy and that water has melted. So in Kali Yuga, or in, let's say, 1,000 years ago, the rules of life were relatively simple or relatively complete. You know, most people grew up, they never traveled more than 20 miles from where they were born. So they knew the terrain, they knew the people, they knew the rules. Everybody had their place in society. It's like the roadmap for Kali Yuga is very different from the roadmap for Dwapara Yuga. A map that works on land is no good whatsoever at sea. And so so when that ice melts, now in our time we're at sea. And that old roadmap doesn't really quite work. And so at sea you can't have a map, you need a compass. Now you can have a map of coastlines and so on, but you need a compass to maneuver around in the sea. And what Yogananda brought was the compass, which were the moral teachings or the spiritual teachings by which we change ourselves, and that gives us the direction to maneuver through, because we're all, Yogananda of course was more so, but we're all strangers in a strange land. We're all in a time, there's never been a time like now. Well, that could be said at any time. There's, you know, as we go through time, we're always at the edge of the unknown. And how do you maneuver through the unknown when a roadmap isn't any good anymore? Well, Yogananda gave us a map for Dwapara Yuga, but that map is not one that's external, it's internal, it's a compass. And his first book, I mentioned a couple of times, was the basic theme was that everybody in the world is looking for happiness and trying to avoid pain. That's the basic motivation for everything that people do. Well, that's not a new thought. You know, that's been a thought in philosophy all along. I just read today something I hadn't known, that Aristotle talked about that same theme, that man's purpose is to find happiness. And interestingly, he said that a virtue is that which draws us closer to happiness, and a vice is that which draws us away. That's a very yogic thought, because it isn't a virtue is fixed. A virtue is that which for you will make you happier. And so what Yogananda came to do in a spiritual sense was, one, to give us a sense of what those virtues are. How can we be happy? And it isn't outside of ourselves. It isn't with fixed rules. It isn't with a roadmap. He said you've got to go within yourself. You've got to calm your mind. He taught meditation. That's primarily what he did, was the teaching of meditation, and then the attitudes or the virtues by which to live to help each of us become happier, more fulfilled individuals. And that quest, that directional quest, has no end. It ends, as he said, in endlessness. It ends when we finally achieve the breakthrough from the sense of being confined in a separate ego, or the soul identified with this single body and this personality. When we get to a high state of consciousness where we become united with everything, which is yoga. That's the meaning of yoga, is that union that takes place. So his primary thrust was to teach the virtues of self-realization. But as I say, it is very interesting to see that he had to go through a very difficult human drama, and he had to walk the talk of what he was talking about. He had to find his own joy in the midst of a lawsuit, in the midst of prejudice, in the midst of financial difficulties. So difficult that, as he said, they were eating tomatoes from the hillside at Mount Washington, just down the road. So it's that combination of the human drama which we all have to live, and they come as examples, they come as models for us. So the combination of the human drama with the divine search and the divine attitudes that makes his life story so powerful. And so I would say that if you haven't done it, get the autobiography in one hand and Phil's book in the other hand, and read sequentially through them.
I'm going to stand up because I am stature challenged and I can't see the people that are here. So, well, I think I'll just start by thanking Phil for what he has offered. I became a disciple of Yogananda Ji in 1969 and have followed him for all of my adult life. And when he told us he was going to write the book, we knew Phil. We were good friends with him from American Veda, one could say. But I trusted him. I trusted his integrity. But I thought, Yogananda has been the pole star of my life. He's something very precious to me, an inner guide, something that I have formed my life around. And although I trusted Phil, I thought, well, I hope he gets it right. And how delighted I was when we read it. And I thought, he got it right. He got it right in the sense that writing in a journalistic, historical style of a historian, he still brought respect, reverence, appreciation, and actually a lot of devotion to that book. So I think he has brought a great contribution to the world of not only spiritual literature and spiritual biographies, but to the times in which we live, where there is so little that you can use as a moral compass, as a guideline to how to proceed. There was another great spiritual teacher who lived some years ago, and he had 4 main biographers. They were, I think we all know them, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And yet, their accounts are very subjective, aren't they? They're different according to who they were, according to how they saw the Master. And one of my favorite lines in the Bible was at the very end, I think it's the last sentence or 2 of John, where he says, I suppose if all the stories would be written down, they would fill volumes. And that's the life of a master. It's impossible to put him in a box. It's impossible to fully capture him. Many direct disciples, Swami Kriyananda being one, and others have written accounts of their time with Yogananda. But a spiritual master is like a beautiful diamond. It reflects light from many, many different angles, depending on what your perspective is. And that's the challenge of trying to really capture the life of a spiritual master. But I think what I'm so grateful to Phil about is that he brings a very important piece, places in place, a piece of the puzzle. Who is this man? What was the significance of his life? What impacted, what did he go through? What did he learn from that? How did that inform how he presented the teachings of the ancient masters of yoga of India to the West and by extension to the world? And this is something important to understand because Jyotish and I spend a lot of time teaching in India, where Ananda has established quite a broad-based work there. And when we first started teaching, Swami Kriyananda, our founder and our teacher, was still alive, and he said, okay, go and you can, teach Master's teachings. And speaking personally, I was totally intimidated. How can I go and teach yoga to Indians, And we kind of said, Swami, we feel a little bit ill-equipped to do this, even though we've been teaching it for decades in the West. And he said, don't think of yourself as a Westerner or an American. Think of yourself as a disciple of Yogananda. That's what these people are not. Whatever their culture is, they're not yet disciples of Yogananda, and that's what you can share. And I thought, oh yes, I can do that. But the beautiful thing that happened as we began teaching in many, many cities in India, Delhi and Bangalore and Chennai and Mumbai and Pune and cities I never heard of, Coimbatore, and was that people, the Indians, were hungry for a new approach to yoga. They were hungry for the yoga that was brought from India, brought to the West, and then internalized and reconfigured according to the Western mentality and life experience. And then when we brought that back to India, it was like people were saying, one woman said so beautifully, she said, I was an Indian friend in Delhi. She said, I was raised with the Bhagavad Gita. I grew up with it. But it was like it was a sacred deity on a pedestal that we poured yogurt over and worshipped. When I read Yogananda's commentaries on the Gita, for the first time, I understood what the Gita was. And so it was just fascinating for us. And weaving together what Phil and Jyotish have been saying, we need to understand how Yogananda, what his experience was in the West, to appreciate more how he re-expressed, not changed at all, but re-expressed Western, or the teachings of yoga to the Western mind. And now when we bring that, another friend of ours said, you know, at first when I saw all you Westerners were teaching meditation and yoga, I kind of laughed. But then, and this was a woman educated in the West, she said, but then when I saw what you did, and it's just what Master did, you systematized meditation. You systematized the path to God. You systematized self-realization in a way, you broke it down into logical steps. Master learned that from all of his experiences in the West. And then when you bring it back, it's like people say, we've been waiting for this, we've been waiting. And Master predicted that a new age would come when the practicality of the West and practical efficiency would be blended with the spiritual depth and understanding of India. He said when those two forces come together, it will help usher the world into a new age, into a higher age. And so what Phil's book does is it helps us to understand how Yogananda got there. When Master went back to India to visit his guru in 1935 and 36, Sri Yukteswar, his guru, who was a little bit, he was, for those of you who don't know, he's the middle picture there, looking at you, kind of like you forgot to lock the car. There's a little bit.
Right behind you.
He's a little bit like, you know, you really don't have your trip together. But so Master went back and visited his guru, first time he'd seen him in 15 years, because he left in 1920 for the West. And Sri Yukteswar said, I'm a little concerned that you're changing the teachings that I've taught you to reach people in the West. And Master had a wonderful answer. He said to his guru, "Sir, you are like the goldsmith. You work in pure gold. I am like the jeweler. I fashion the gold so that people can wear it." And when he said that, Sri Yukteswar said, "I understand, and you have my blessings." And so that's what Yogananda did. And we understand how and why he did it from the episodes in Phil's book. He took the gold that this great lineage gave him, and he fashioned it so that we can use it. And as we said, the challenge of really understanding a master, in all truth, you have to be one to know one. But still, we can try to understand with our hearts and with our minds, who is this master? Who is he? But there's a story, and I'll end with this, and then if you have questions, we'll have Phil answer them, because he knows a lot more facts than me. There's a story of the 7 blind men and the elephant. And it's a metaphor. But there are these 7 blind brothers wandering along the roads of India, and they encounter an elephant. And they say, "Brothers, what is this? What is this wonderful creature?" And one of them feels the side of the elephant, the flank, and he said, "Oh, the elephant is like a big wall." And then the other one said, "No, no, no." And this one's been holding the tail. He said, "No, no, the elephant is like a rope." And then one of them is feels the legs. And he goes, "No, brothers, you're both wrong. The elephant is like a great tree trunk." And then the one says, "How can you say that?" He's holding the trunk. "The elephant is like a wiggly snake." And then the other one says, "My brothers, how are you all so foolish? Don't you know the elephant is like a great fan?" He's holding the ear, he's touching the ear. And so that's what it's like. And it's a metaphor. How do you know truth? If you just see a little part of it, you don't get the whole big picture. And that's the way it is with the Master's life. I think those direct disciples that have written their subjective accounts, like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they give us a glimpse. The inspired biographers and historians who give us a more historical approach, they give us a part of it. And it's our job to put it all together. And if we want to know who these masters really are, then the way we really know them, with the mind, with the heart, but most importantly, we know them in the deep stillness of our own being, where we realize that our own higher self is really who these masters are. The light that shines in them is the light that shines in us. And in Autobiography, I'll just close with this. If you remember, when Yogananda was a little boy, he would go to visit many saints in India. He describes them. And they all called him Chota Mahashaya. And he translates that, Master translates that as little sir. But when we were in India, someone came up to us and said, "It doesn't mean little sir. It means little, small, enlightened one. Mahashaya means great soul. So it means child, great soul." But he doesn't put it that way. In his humility, he just says little sir. So that's who we all are. We're Chota Mahashaya, little great soul. We're not quite there yet, but little, by looking at the different facets of these great masters, we can start awakening ourselves.